talk about the geographic dimensions of this problem. When we think about small cities, rural communities, there's often this sort of broad imagination of whiteness. I live in Philadelphia, so I have heard Pennsylvania referred to, quite frequently. But when we think about the implications of rising small city and rural incarceration, it's really important to note that there are also implications for racial justice and for gender justice. We see that the sharpest racial disparities in incarceration are actually in the nation's smallest communities. We also see that small cities and rural communities are driving a national increase of women in jail. And we know that both of these things, once again, are also related to a money bail system and to broader inequities that show up in jail admissions. So to shout out one of the participants today, Josh Vaughn's work at the Appeal to help figure out what the scale of wealth extraction through imposition of money bail looked like across the state of Pennsylvania showed that there were staggering disparities in who was being assessed money bail and the sheer amount of money being taken from Black defendants. Similarly, when we think about, again, the gender dynamics of incarceration, we know that women are less likely to be assessed money bail when they're pretrial, but they're also less likely to be able to afford it because of broader inequities in wealth. We also know nationally that about 2/3 of the women who are behind bars because they can't make a bail amount are mothers of children under the age of 18 and overwhelmingly primary caregivers. So again, right, to sort of give broader context to this issue and some of the particular dimensions and facets of criminal justice and mass incarceration across the urban to rural spectrum, we see that jails in this role as mass incarceration's front door have broad impacts that ripple past just the individuals who cycle out each year millions of times and into families and into communities. I can pass to Claire maybe to talk a little bit about our work to build reform and to work across the urban to rural spectrum together, Caddy, and then maybe come back to your questions about particular dimensions that journalists might cover. Great.
Hi. Am I hearable? Yes, I'm hearable. Okay. Hi, I'm Claire Shubik Richards, and I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Prison Society. And I have both the privilege of leading the Prison Society, which, as some of you know, is the oldest human rights organization in the United States, founded in 1787 by Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush, 3 months before the start of the Constitutional Convention. And our mission for 234 years has been to advocate for humane prison conditions and sensible criminal justice policies. I also have the honor to work with some of the people that you've heard from today. So Jasmine, and we're going to talk about our work together, Su Ming, and I want to express my gratitude to Joe Jafari, who's on the call, and Joshua Vaughn, who are just great journalists covering these issues. I'm going to talk about my work with Jasmine, our work here at the Society with Jasmine. I'm also going to talk about how the Prison Society can be a resource to journalists. And I want to highlight somebody else who's joining us today, who is Joel Wolfram. And Joel is a freelance journalist who we brought on to the Prison Society early on in the pandemic to help us push out information on what was happening in Pennsylvania's prisons and jails during COVID-19. So I'm delighted that Joel is here with us, and really, if there's one takeaway that I want you to get from seeing my face on your computer screen, it's that the Prison Society is a resource for you on reporting what's happening in Pennsylvania's prisons and jails during the pandemic, impacting 76,000 people, Pennsylvanians living behind bars, 1% of the state's adult population. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, if my screen allows me to share. Okay. So this is another form of what Jasmine just shared to you. This is the Prison Society's fact sheet on use of jails in Pennsylvania. So you see that there are 62 county jails. That jail population in the Commonwealth has risen by 260%, despite an overall decrease in crime. And that in 2018, and this is a fact sheet from 2018, we'll be updating this summer. In 2018, the population in Pennsylvania prisons declined by 7%, and that decline was entirely caused by Philadelphia. So, as Jasmine was pointing out, county use of rural use of incarceration continues to go up and drives much of what we see. So, what I have here in front of you and is the Prison Society's COVID-19 landing page. And I think one thing I should say about this landing page and its audiences and its use for you as journalists are, we really have two audiences for this landing page. First is all of you, people that can help inform the public and policymakers on what's happening in Pennsylvania's prisons and jails. Our second audience are the families of incarcerated people who rely on us for credible information about what is happening to their loved ones behind bars. So as I mentioned, 76,000 Pennsylvanians, 1% of the adult population, lives in custody of the state or a county, and they all have families. So it's estimated that 1 in every 2 Americans has a loved one who is or has served time behind bars. And they turn to us about their loved ones and their access to them. So what I'm about to show you is both designed for your consumption, but also designed to help families who are looking for information to help them navigate this crisis in their day-to-day. So when the pandemic started, the ACLU petitioned the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania and asked that the Supreme Court order that counties release people who were at high risk of COVID-19 and serious consequences from COVID-19, and that they release enough people to allow for social distancing in prisons. And in fact, the ACLU in its lawsuit, and we were the plaintiffs in their lawsuit, listed specific types of people that they requested that counties release to allow for social distancing and mitigation of the spread of the pandemic. The Supreme Court declined to issue exactly the ACLU's order, but they did issue an order saying, counties, we call on you to reduce your jail populations to allow for social distancing. So Jasmine and I put our heads together and we asked ourselves, is this really happening? The Supreme Court issued this order. Are any of the counties actually following up on it? And so together we started contacting, and Vera did most of the legwork here, contacting every single county in the Commonwealth to ask what their jail population was the last day of February before the pandemic started, what it was at the end of April, and then subsequently we've asked what it is at the end of June, and we'll be continuing this going forward. What we found is there's been a 25% decrease in the number of people incarcerated in Pennsylvania county jails. And that's the largest decrease in the use of incarceration in history. And Vera has a great report on this, and I'm sure Jasmine will point you to the link and talk about it, but I'm going to talk about, and in Vera's report, they're looking not only at Pennsylvania, but several other states. I'll talk about what we know about Pennsylvania. Broadly speaking, and I'll show you some neat things about the map. So the map allows you to toggle onto a county and see what the decrease in the population has been, and this is through the end of June. And then if you click on a county, it will actually, and all credit is due to Joel, for putting this together. It will bring you to a sheet displaying information specifically on the county, its jail population, resources for families, and then also information about the population. So, you know, what Jasmine's research and the Vera team's research showed was this dramatic decrease in the use of incarceration, county incarceration. So what we wanted to know was, what's behind this and will it last? And maybe now I'll turn it over to Jasmine to talk about the sort of the three tranches of counties, or the three categories of counties that we've seen.
Perfect. Sure. So as Claire said, right, when we looked across the country and tried to understand sort of what had happened in the first several months of the rapid spread of the pandemic, we saw this 25% decline. And there are really, to pull apart what's happening there, two primary dynamics, right? Unsurprisingly, the very things that shape who's in jail. It's who is going in, how jail bookings are changing, and who is being released, right? And what are the forms of release? Across the board, forthcoming data will show that we saw declines in bookings across the urban to rural spectrum everywhere, which is not surprising. I think the interesting piece to begin to pull out, which we really can't do with data, is to what degree that is because people were staying at home. They were not being arrested because they were sheltering in place. They were following local health orders. And to what degree that is the result of an intentional policy choice to expand the use of citations, to use non-custodial arrest. The other things that we see broadly, again, just comparing early 2020 to 2019, is some increase proportionally in the rate at which people were bonding out of jail or were being released because of court releases. And so just for, again, I think macro framing, what that shows as a proof point, right, is that rapid decarceration has always been possible. There was always been, again, this vast discretion to choose either not to use arrest or to set affordable bail or to release people on non-financial conditions, so on recognizance, on supervision, one of the other many forms of non-monetary release that exists. Since then, unsurprisingly, because the criminal justice system is a system comprised of many, many actors and many, many different decision points, we've seen counties move in different directions. And Claire, I may share my screen for a moment again. We can just go back and forth to show the trends to the degree possible. But overall, in Pennsylvania and across the country, right, looking at those data points, we saw that some counties never really declined or increased overall. We saw some counties begin to decline and then level out, and then we saw a subset of counties that either declined dramatically or to some degree and then really rebounded. And so we've built this tool, which I will link, and we'll have future data to be added to it, that allows you to understand, looking over time, for each Pennsylvania county that would give us information how the jail population changed and the broad trajectory. And if we look at this scatter, right, it allows you to very immediately, again, discern what some of the outliers are. You can see up top, because this is a population and not a rate, unsurprisingly, again, this is Philadelphia with the largest overall volume of people in jail, but it is not a major urban county that saw an overall increase in this time. It's Clinton County with a 24% increase, much smaller numbers, but I think overall right across the board seeing incarceration go up, even as in aggregate the rest of the country was moving in the opposite direction. And so I think, again, right, what this underscores is a couple of things. First, we will never end mass incarceration without concerted work to end mass incarceration everywhere and to look across the urban to rural spectrum. And the other, I think, once again, is both the opportunities and the perils that are created by having such unfettered discretion in every courtroom across the state and in every police encounter to choose how to use arrest, how to set bail or not, the kinds of conditions that are imposed at release, whether or not someone's supervision is going to be violated, either probation or pretrial supervision, and the way in which that I think particularly in smaller counties can reflect the choices of a very small set of actors, which I think is another thing that really comes out of this data, right? When you look at small communities that were able to rapidly decarcerate in the face of spreading COVID-19 behind bars in communities and nationally, often it was because of the choice of the president judge themselves or a single actor who was very committed to decarceration. Sort of in opposition, right, we see in some of the counties, the smaller counties that have had across the country, persistently high rates of jail incarceration and prison admissions, it's because a single judge, a single president judge, or a single system actor has really decided that they are going to take the most punitive approach to the criminal justice system. And my colleague, who's a quantitative or qualitative researcher, has a story from upstate New York, much of what is not that dissimilar from parts of Pennsylvania, where after he was interviewing the only full-time city court judge in a small city, he followed him out to the car and he said, you know, for 20 years, we had the highest incarceration rate in the state, and I could pretty much do what I wanted because no one was watching. And so I think particularly for a group of journalists, right, one of the sort of parables looking at this changing geography, at the wildly different trends in the context of COVID, is that we really need people to be watching everywhere. And that is continues to be true, as you know, Claire's work and the Prison Society's work shows, with conditions behind bars, and also as we are in this first continued and hopefully not forever wave of COVID, where potentially being behind bars can be a death sentence for many people, and it's really vital that the people in smaller jails across the state are not out of sight and out of mind. Caddy, I think you're muted.
Yes, thank you both. Pardon my sort of my fumbling here. Thank you both. There's questions coming in, but if I could start with the questions, because I'd spoken with y'all, Jasmine, months ago about this. Would you paint for us what this work, this engagement looks like on a grassroots level in Pennsylvania, but also tell the journalists the other places where this work is going on?
Certainly. So, the sort of theory of change for our work has been that there needs to be simultaneous reform at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level, which is ambitious and relies very heavily on having partners like Claire and many other even smaller organizations working in small cities and rural communities across the country. So one of the things that we do is partner directly with state advocates and local advocates who are driving reforms in their own communities. That has really been the genesis of our deepest partnership with the Prison Society, helping to build with other organizations a sort of platform and a cohort of reformers working across the urban to rural spectrum in Pennsylvania. We have partners in at least 20 other states working in many, many communities. And so a lot of what we do is try to put policy blueprints, data, and research into people's hands to drive and sustain decarceration and reforms in their own backyards, with a specific focus, right, on how do you shift resources out of the criminal justice system, out of spending money on jails and prisons, and into communities, into community-based forms of support and care. At the same time, we work on a scaffolding of policy change at the state level. So focusing on the broad criminalization of poverty, including the use of money bail, and in many states, you know, on the ways in which counties have decided to overbuild their jails to take advantage of federal contracts. So things like the ICE contracts that exist in York County and Pike County, where counties are trying to sort of financially survive by renting beds to the federal government. And then we are about to unveil, this is your exclusive on a webinar, but a federal piece of legislation with bipartisan sponsors that would incentivize decarceration in rural America. So we recognize that, you know, while jails are fundamentally a local policy issue, over the past several decades, both the use of federal dollars, ICE, U.S. Marshals, and others to rent out jail beds, and the use of grant programs, including from the USDA, has fueled jail expansion across the country, that the federal government has really incentivized and subsidized the building of more and bigger jails, and we're trying to sort of turn the page on that and reverse that, again, seizing on this still fragile bipartisan consensus around criminal justice reform.
What are some of the other, in addition to the Prison Society, the other organizations in Pennsylvania that y'all are working with, from the bigger ones to the tiny ones out wherever?
So I'm going to go ahead and drop into the chat a link to our full swath of community partners. But I will also say, you know, we collaborate with folks in a lot of more informal ways too, where either people will reach out to us or we'll reach out to them. We'll provide local incarceration data, train members. And so another, you know, unlikely place, not truly rural, but smaller that we have focused has been Scranton and Lackawanna County in Northeast Pennsylvania, in large part because, again, that's a region that certainly has experienced economic abandonment and decline, and very high rates of incarceration, a very punitive approach generally in the justice system. We also, I think, like many people, have had eyes on Lancaster County in central Pennsylvania more recently. The news of a judge setting just wildly unaffordable bail in relationship to a protest, you know, and more broadly, I think, again, that illuminates the incredible discretion of judicial actors in the system, which is something that I think, alongside the very important attention that has been paid to prosecutorial discretion, really merits a closer, further, and sustained look, in part because there are very few accountability mechanisms, right, for the people, often magisterial district judges who are not lawyers, who are making some of those first essential decisions about whether or not someone will walk free before trial. So that's sort of, broadly speaking, right, the swath, but we're also continuing to collaborate with the Prison Society in a subset of counties, and then more broadly looking across the state.
What was that bail? This is related to current protests? Where was that? What was the bail? What happened?
This is Lancaster County, and I'm sure many of the journalists on this call could talk about it in even greater detail than I could. It is, of course, I think, often imagined as Amish country, but Lancaster County has a small city. After a man was recently killed by the police, there were large-scale protests that included some property destruction, and one of the protesters, who was also a street medic and had been at some of the other Black Lives Matter demonstrations in front of police stations throughout the summer, had an blatantly unconstitutional bail set. So the Pennsylvania law provides that bail is meant to be set in a reasonable amount to ensure people's appearance. Her bail was set so far in excess of what it was possible to afford, and subsequently reduced, I think many people would say, as sort of a warning or a message. The Supreme Court has, of course, said that in our society, liberty is the norm, and detention the carefully limited exception. I think that story is one snapshot into a larger truth that too often detention is the norm and is not carefully limited.
I'm going to move. I have some questions, but I'll move to, before I get to mine, the journalist question. So this is from Kareth Gabriel, Philadelphia Weekly, says it's for you, Jasmine. On a local level, how much slower has the drag for reform been in Philadelphia County compared to other counties throughout the state?
I think in many ways, the the emphasis on reform in Philadelphia has accelerated incredibly quickly in recent years. There is a vibrant and rich set of civil society actors who are holding policymakers accountable. There are elected and appointed officials who are committed. Philadelphia has engaged in the safety and justice challenge. When we look across the country and across the state of Pennsylvania, often at smaller communities, right, it is often the same set of people who are doing prison and jail visitation, who are the prison society volunteers, who are trying to sort of formulate what other local policy changes might look like. And so I think one of the sort of interesting dynamics of the pace of reform is also just who is sort of doing the work inside and outside of the system, and how well or much it is shared through a broad set of civil society actors as opposed to a narrow set of people who are doing a lot of the work. And I think, Claire, who, because of the incredible and unique role that the Prison Society has nationally, really also has pretty clear eyes into the juxtaposition between the state's two biggest counties, the two big cities, and sort of what that looks like in the rest of the state.
If I can add on to Kara's question, and I hope my own is not too pedestrian, but how do these conversations, their sort of tone and color and nuance, differ from the city to the rural to these smaller towns in Pennsylvania? Like, where are they along that trajectory of discussing reform?
Claire, do you want to talk first just about the sort of trajectory of who the Prison Society volunteers are across the urban to rural spectrum?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, and I can talk a little bit about our work together and then maybe circle back to the question about Philadelphia's pace for reform and compared to the rest of the state. So, by law, the Prison Society is the state's ombuds. We have access to interview all people who are incarcerated privately. And we get, prior to the pandemic, about 300 requests for assistance a month from incarcerated people and their families to look into situations that they're dealing with behind prison walls. That number has increased since the pandemic. The way that we respond to people in prison and serve as the state's ombuds is through a network of volunteers. So we have also approximately 300 volunteers across the Commonwealth who we support in going into prisons, meeting with incarcerated people, and then liaising with prison administrators to let them know of issues within their facilities. Our 300 volunteers are from the communities where they volunteer. And so our Philadelphia chapter, which is one of our strongest chapters, is a very racially and economically diverse chapter that has a number of people who have been incarcerated, that has a number of people that are involved with the large family of criminal justice reform organizations in Philadelphia. Typically, our volunteers are not just Prison Society volunteers, but they're members of lots of other organizations and coalitions. But if you go to Lebanon County, our volunteers come from two religious communities primarily, and are religiously motivated to care about the treatment of people behind bars. If you go to Center County, where arguably we have one of our strongest volunteer groups, we have retired law enforcement, active and retired faculty, formerly incarcerated people, and people with quite strong ties to Center County government and administration. So our volunteers reflect the communities where they advocate for criminal justice reform. What our partnership with Vera has looked like in terms of our volunteers and for pushing for reform in different counties is that Vera has been helping us in training and training our volunteers and facilitating conversations with county administration on how they use their criminal justice system. So, as Jasmine alluded to, sort of to get back to the first question is, what's the pace of criminal justice reform in Philadelphia? And I'm actually going to share my screen again. Let's try that. Okay. So I'm actually not going to show you that. Let's see if this is going to let me do this. Nope, I'm going to show you this. Criminal justice reform in Philadelphia is as old as the prison society is. It's a conversation that has never died in Philadelphia. The pursuit of justice, the desire for justice, and what you have in front of you is a report from 2010. It comes in a long line of reports about the need for criminal justice reform in Philadelphia. I'm pointing you to this report. It's a report published by the Pew Charitable Trust in 2010 for a couple of reasons. One is I wrote it, but the other reason is I think it's actually quite helpful in understanding what's happening now. So in 2010, our jail population here in Philly was about double what it is now. And there were lots and lots of meetings about the need for criminal justice reform. Population in big city prisons like New York were going down, and in Philadelphia it wasn't. Right now, we have a jail population that's about half the size of what it was in 2010 in Philadelphia. And the biggest change that has happened between 2010 and 2020 to account for that change is called Larry Krasner. And I like to think that this report may be a helpful resource for those of you that are not as familiar with the criminal justice process and the various decision points that lead to incarceration. So mass incarceration isn't just because of one decision point. There's one point in the criminal justice process in which a decision is made to incarcerate. It's actually a variety of decision points that can take in Philly well over a year. And while a case progresses through the court process, throughout that year, there are opportunities for someone to be incarcerated. And so on page 27 of this report, what I have out here is a handy dandy flow chart that helps you understand what contributes to over-incarceration or incarceration generally. So we talked about, I mentioned how Philly was slow out of the gate, but now has had a dramatic decrease in incarceration. When we're talking about the pandemic and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's order to allow for social distancing, we have a different story. And the contrast that's easiest to make is here with Allegheny County, our sister big city, whereas you see they've decreased their use of their jail by 31%. And if we go over here to Philly, it's 16%. So not only is that not as big a decrease, and like Philly, Allegheny County has, for the several years, been working to decrease its population overall. Not only is that a smaller decrease in Philly, but it happened much faster in Allegheny. And this goes to a point that Jasmine was making, and I think goes back to what Kathy was asking about, which is it's all about relationships and the people in that county. So Jasmine and I interviewed the criminal justice leadership in Allegheny County, and we asked, why were you able to achieve this dramatic decrease so quickly? And it had to do with the prosecutor, the defense, the court, the county executive, all having fairly good working relationships with one another and sitting down at the start of the pandemic and reviewing every single docket of every single person who was in that jail and having a holistic conversation about who needed to be in that prison or in that jail for public safety, and who was actually posing a greater risk to public health by remaining in that jail. In Philadelphia, as those of you who have covered it know, getting out of the gate to start having those conversations at the start of the pandemic were really hard. The relationships were much more adversarial, much more cumbersome. There were many more people around the table, and that results in delay and not as big a decrease. That's also why you see in some of these counties where we've done interviews, it may be one president judge who just said, I'm going to make sure that we do this, or it may be a consortium of people who can work together in that county.
I'm going to jump to more questions. Thank you both. This is from Joe Jafari from Spotlight. regarding reductions in populations, jail populations. Have we seen any forecasting on what the future might look like come this next flu season and on into 2021? For those counties that rebounded in population, is there any reason to think that the population might drop again?
I think, the important thing to, again, underscore, and maybe this is pedantic, but it could drop because it will be the result of a policy choice to make that happen, or it could not. And it depends, I think, on how seriously, people are willing to collaborate, as Claire has pointed to, and how quickly they're able to sit at a table and to come up with a comprehensive plan. I think in how much this broad set of system actors decides to value the lives of people who are behind bars. I mean, I think in many ways it's often tempting for me to talk about us being past the first wave of the pandemic, or even in a criminal justice context post-pandemic, which is so divorced from reality, because we are seeing in so many places the population swing back up again, or some of the measures sort of being relaxed. And I think, the really frustrating piece about that, and maybe a particular frame for the conversation, right, is that so often now across the country, when we are hearing stories about people dying in medical isolation units in jails, getting sick, they are people who have been arrested on things like failure to appear for a court date, or contempt, or a probation violation, and a continued sort of adherence to using the criminal justice system, using arrest and jail booking to manage people, to manage the appearance of people, and their adherence to conditions of supervision or to rules, rather than really focusing on this question of balancing public health and public safety, right? And so I do think that will continue to have to be at the forefront of our minds. I think another, I looked briefly at the Q&A, and I think there's this question of why in some rural jails was rapid decarceration possible beyond just the collaboration or the outsized power that sits with one person. And I think the other thing to really dig into, and to some degree there's a poverty of data on this, we have some of it, is what people are actually in jail for. So looking at rural Greene County, Pennsylvania, right, and just some data that we have pulled down from the publicly available jail roster, the majority of charges, the top 10 most prevalent charges of people in the jail, on average, prior to decarceration spurred by COVID, were driving related. They were things like driving on a suspended license, or driving without a vehicle being registered. And so I think the other piece that this points to is that some counties very suddenly said, oh, what are we using our jail for? Should we change that in the short term? And the question inherent in that is, should you also change it in the long term, right?
Would you parse that just a bit more, and even sort of pre-COVID? You had mentioned in your earlier remarks, or one of you did, substance use disorder and how that's factored into the detention rates. Can you break that down sort of roughly? So there's pre-COVID, what was it, and post? Yeah, substance use, driving issues. What are the legal entanglements?
So I think, part of the challenge right now is we have 3,000 plus local jails across the country. There's different cadences and degrees of reporting on who is in jail when in counties and in states. I think one of the many points of collaboration Claire and I are both interested in is greater transparency just with who is in jail and why in any given day in any given place. Right now, the last state published data in Pennsylvania is from 2018, which in this moment, right, feels like ancient history. So that said, what we do know broadly, right, is that lower level offenses related to things like possession, or, so in some places, charges related to being in a place where drugs are usually sold. Those kinds of charges overwhelmingly drive people into jail. Relatedly, there are also a lot of low-level public order offenses, which often can point to untreated mental health needs. These are not people who are dangerous or violent or scary, but are existing in public space, often because they are homeless or don't have anywhere else to go. Anecdotally, I'm sure we all have stories of hearing about things like, people intentionally setting $500 bail on someone who is homeless and struggling with substance use because they say, well, I know that this person, A, is going to show up for court if I keep them in jail, and B, I know that they're not going to overdose and die if I release them. And I think that particular question, right, the degree to which jails and incarceration should be used to manage public health problems obviously came to the forefront of a lot more people's minds in the past several months. Over and over again, I have heard in courtrooms and in state legislatures across the country, people are kept in jail because we don't have adequate resources to treat substance use. We don't have adequate resources to respond to mental health needs in the community. So as long as we keep them here, we know they'll be okay. This is counter to a couple of broad macro pieces of data that we have. As I said before, right, we know that being incarcerated makes people more likely to die of overdose after they've released. Obviously, there's been an expansion of MAT, of medication-assisted treatment in jails across the country. But we also know broadly that because of these destabilizing impacts of incarceration, right, there are social harms that can't just be sort of pushed aside by saying, well, we'll provide people with resources after they're released. And so I think the thing really to grapple with, particularly at this moment, but also more broadly, is what happens when we continue to collapse all treatment resources into the criminal justice system, when the first line response for this whole range of social problems and public health problems becomes a jail. And that, again, is going to be the most acute in smaller and resource-poor communities, where when you build specialty treatment beds inside a jail in order to respond to growing arrests related to drugs, there's no money left to build that infrastructure in the community.
So we have a couple of minutes left. I want to circle back to this question about the sort of the politics and tenor of Pennsylvania. Is from Joseph, and he says, in these rural counties with large jail populations drops, there has also been a concerted push against mass business closures, etc. It would seem like the political culture in these regions would mean fewer releases, but the opposite has happened. Does that mean anything to either of you, or what does that mean, both of you?
Claire, do you want to take that? I already sort of talked about the...
I think there's not a total match. So Joe's totally right that there are some communities where we've seen pushback, but we've also seen large drops. And then there are other small communities where we've seen pushbacks at the governor and they haven't reduced their population. I think the most interesting place for us right now is Lebanon County. Lebanon County, we've gotten several calls about problems in that jail right now. We always get problems about that jail. And of course, that's the county that declined CARES Act funding initially. So yes, in many places, these counties are sort of fiefdoms or jurisdictions unto themselves with very local decision making. I think that's part of the power of us having localized volunteers, that people from the community are working with them. But also, let's talk about the fact that in places in which mask wearing and social distancing is not being adhered to, that's where it's going to get into the jail. How does COVID get into the jail? It gets in from the people who are coming in and out. Who are the people coming in and out? It's the guards. Most jails in the Commonwealth are doing a decent job of testing and quarantining, at least quarantining new admissions. So where is it going to come in from? It's going to come in from the guards. Once it gets through the jail, it's going to spread like wildfire, and then the guards are going to bring it back out. So I think that it's not a one-to-one overlap of a county that doesn't necessarily follow CDC guidance is going to be a county that decarcerates or not. I think that there are a lot of different factors going on.
So my parting questions, 15 seconds each. What story hasn't been done or hasn't been done well that y'all think these journalists ought to be tackling?
Claire, do you want to go first?
Yes, and I think I've just put something, let's see if I put something in the chat. Maybe I have the ability to, or maybe I don't. I'm going to attempt to, let's see if it works. So what I just listed was the recommendations that we put at the end of every single supporter update. So I want to just emphasize that we're a resource for you, our fact sheets, our reports, our interactive map, our coverage of every single county in the Commonwealth to some degree, our resources on them. And I personally am a resource to you as you're trying to make sense of the maze that is the criminal justice system in Pennsylvania, from policing to community supervision. I am happy to help you parse things out and understand. What I put in the chat is the 6 recommendations that we put at the end of our weekly supporter update on prison conditions in the Commonwealth. And I think all 6 of these things have particular relevance in COVID, but they also have analogous relevance without COVID. So for example, and Joe, thank you for raising this issue repeatedly, is the medical copay. The medical copay in prison has particular importance now during COVID, but it always has importance. Jails, county jails, actually providing data on who's in them has particular importance during COVID, where an outbreak in a prison has tremendous impact for the spread of the virus in the community, particularly in rural communities. It's really important that jails provide that, but they're not required to. And it's important that jails provide public information when we're not in the pandemic. On your last panel, one of your panelists said that in several of the county jails where he provides medical care, 4 people have died. He couldn't provide that information to you, and he asked you to go to the Department of Health. I will tell you, the Pennsylvania Department of Health will not give you that information. And that's really important information to know. And I want to give kudos to Joe for covering that issue.
And I will say, sorry. As I said, I live in Philadelphia. So someone just drove by my house. I think to pick up a particular piece, right, the medical copays piece, since I've already talked at great length about the discretion of judges and about reporting data, I think the other piece to underscore is there is increased fluency and understanding of the role of money bail in our system. It's really important to also underscore that that exists alongside a larger system of wealth extraction through the criminal justice system of tremendous cost to the users. And because we keep shouting out the journalists who we love who have covered these issues, I'll say, Josh, for example, Joshua Vaughn has written about the fees that are attached to the pleasure of pleading guilty in Pennsylvania, the incredible array of fines and fees that come across the justice system. This has particular resonance in this moment, I think in particular importance. We know that one of the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic has been really dramatic economic decline at the state level and at the county level, that it's likely that we're entering a period of economic austerity. And I think one of the perils of this moment, even for people who are not sort of left behind in the jail, but are on electronic monitors, or on other forms of supervision, are still moving through the court system, is that the system attempts to fill budget gaps by making people pay, right, to move through criminalization, essentially. We know, just really quickly from data, that the 2019-2020 judicial budget request for Pennsylvania proposes collecting $113.9 million in fees. This is only 13% of the state budget, but for an overwhelmingly poor constituency who is in our courts and our prisons and our jails, that is a catastrophic amount of money. Similarly, over the past 10 years, they report that the judiciary alone, so not jail fees, not medical copays, just the judiciary, has collected $4.65 billion in fines, fees, and costs. Some of that is restitution, but of that total amount, less than 1% went to victims of crime. So overall, what we see, right, the consequences of the rise of mass incarceration, of this catastrophically ballooning system, has been increased cost that then is passed on to some of the most vulnerable people in communities. So thinking again about economic decline across the urban to rural spectrum, the rise of incarceration, the political character of places, I would say this remains one of the most important, critical, and vital stories, particularly as counties grapple with really lean budgets.
Claire and Jasmine, Ms. Hyson, Ms. Shubik Richards, we appreciate it. Thank you so very, very much. All right, thank you. Steve? You're on mute, darling. You're unmute.
It's funny, I unmuted myself and then I got muted again. So thank you, Jasmine, and thank you, Shubik, Claire, but I hope you guys will be able to stay on if you're still there. What I'd like to do is move immediately into the last portion